All right, welcome everybody to Coug Connect, and a real pleasure to introduce our special presenter today, Obie Ford. And I'll just turn it over to Obie to share his screen and get us started. Welcome, Obie.
Good morning. I want to make sure everybody can hear me. It is a pleasure to be with you all this morning. Thank you so much to the Coug Connect team for inviting me, Don, Kendra, HRS, really appreciate it. I want to begin with our land acknowledgement at WSU Vancouver. We welcome you to our campus, WSU Vancouver. We are in the homeland of Chinookan and Taitnapam peoples and the Cowlitz Indian tribe. Today we're going to be doing some work around realizing racial equity and justice. And before we get into that, I do want to get a feel for who's in the space. I'm saying that the group is growing. We're already at about 47 folks, and so I anticipate maybe a few more entering the space. But perhaps if you could use the chat box just to share your name, any social identities and attributes that you'd like to share, your pronouns, which campus of WSU are you with, and what's your affiliation, as well as your unit and department. That would be wonderful. And as you're doing that, I'll share a little bit more about myself. Again, Obie Ford III, Associate Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at WSU Vancouver. My pronouns are he, him, his. I've been with WSU now for 3 years, and it has been just a wonderful journey thus far, and it's an honor to be able to do this work alongside each of you. And so I'm seeing the chats coming in. Thank you so much. So I see Jenny Glass, welcome. Becky, Katie, Macy, thank you all for being here. Rocky and Shelley, thank you. Lynn from the Vancouver campus, hello. See Keela and Jenny and Angela, welcome. Andrea, Courtney. Dulce, Anna, welcome. Sharon, Jake, Jennifer, thank you for being here. Heather, Caitlin, Julia, hello. Alex, Hikari, Lindsay, Emily, thank you. See Heather, Allison Matthews, Kate McAteer, hello. Allison Phillip, Judy, thank you. Kelly, Valerie, Bonnie, Teddy, thank you so much. Rachel, Melissa, Amy, welcome. Jim and Kelsey, welcome to this session. Rita and Cheryl, welcome. And so as you continue to use the chat box, we'll refer to it again in a few moments. And so I want us to think about this space that we're holding today and some grounding assumptions for this space, right? And so everybody, if you could just take a deep breath and exhale. So I just want us to remember to breathe through this session. And I think that in this current climate that we're in, we have to recognize the privilege of breath, right? And too many, far too many of our fellow human beings, namely Black men and women, you know, their last words have been, I can't breathe, right? And so I want us to really think about the power and the privilege of breath during our time together. And, you know, during this session, we're recognizing that racism and systemic racism are real. And I'm not wanting to engage in a negotiation of that during this space. I'm happy to hold space with anyone who would like to have a deeper conversation about that following this session. But again, as we think about our society at large, as well as our campus communities and our students, our faculty and staff, particularly students, faculty, and staff of color, right? And what they are leaning into, what we're all leaning into during this time is so critical that we name racism and systemic racism as being real. I invite you to be present, to stay engaged, be brave, right? There will be some moments where you are asked to speak your truth, right? And understand that your truth belongs to you. Listen for understanding as opposed to interrupting. Lean into this work and expect and accept non-closure. We're together for just 1 hour, folks, right? And so, you know, I see my part today as a facilitator of dialogue and of action once you leave this space. And I think once you leave this space, that's where the most important work begins, right? How do I begin to show up in advocacy? Take care of yourself. We're showing up from our respective spaces. And so if you need to step away, please step away. If you need to take a breath, remember to take a breath. But I do ask that you return to this space. Your presence and your feedback and point of view are very much needed here. Interact, participate. I tend to hold very interactive spaces. So my Vancouver folks that's on this call and others who have worked with me before know that. And let the good work that you do here, let it leave here. Again, as I mentioned before, you know, we're showing up in facilitation of this space, right? The real work begins when you leave here. Remember love as a foundational piece of this work, right? Are showing up in critique or having a critical lens or a racial equity lens, right? That is a form of love for this institution, WSU, as well as our society at large and community members who reside within it. And finally, I want you to be thinking about how do I take what I receive from here, what is at least one thing that I can take from today and incorporate into my practice, right? We each can do equity work from wherever we sit within the university and from whatever position we hold within the structure, right? And so be thinking about what is at least one thing that I can do, right, to advance equity, anti-racism, justice, diversity, inclusion, and belonging from this day forward. Okay, and so as we think about engaging in this crucial conversation about race, systemic racism, I also want you to reflect on the current movement for Black lives, and also recognizing that this movement is more than 400 years old, right? When we think about the first Africans to arrive to our shores, right, in 1619, and also thinking about your experience with race, right? How do you show up? Which is a question that we'll ask shortly. Examine your advocacy for Black people and people of color in general, brown people, indigenous people, Native American people, Asian people. And again, identifying those specific actions that you will commit to realize racial equity and justice from this point forward. What have you been doing up to now, right? And how do we continue to engage in this work in meaningful and authentic and impactful ways? So I want to think about and speak names of our fellow human beings, right, who have been taken by state violence and other forms of violence. And I think this image is so powerful. It was taken by Devin Allen, and this was in Baltimore. This was 2015, and it made a Time cover, right? America 1968, right? Juxtaposed to 2015. And I find it striking that here we are just 5 years later, and this image, right, looks eerily the same, right? And so in 5 years, what has changed? And then when we think about that from 1968, it's a really powerful image. And so when I think about speaking names, right, and thinking about the space that we're in with Black Lives Matter and, this image, I'm not a threat, right? And I also think about this just as an African-American man, right? And how I show up in these spaces and the many strategies and coping mechanisms that I utilize to, in lieu of the sign, I'm not a threat, right? Again, this notion of I can't breathe, right? And so it's critical that we acknowledge the lived experiences of our fellow human beings, including Black Americans, as well as the very real policies that are leading to, right, the injuries of Black and Brown and Indigenous people and people of color, right? It's critical that we speak names of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, right? Breonna Taylor, an essential employee, an essential worker, an EMT, right? And when I look at Breonna Taylor, I see someone who could be my daughter. I see someone who could be my niece, right? Manuel Ellis, Tacoma, Washington, what could have been or should have been a routine stop, right, results in his death. And his last words are, I can't breathe, right? Eerily similar to George Floyd. Daniel Prude, who was out of Rochester and having a mental health episode. And, we've seen it in the news. And, but just thinking again about the tragic nature of his death and those who I mentioned already, Jacob Blake, who has survived, so it appears, his shooting 7 times, shot in the back, right? But may be paralyzed from the waist down. And he spoke this weekend, gave some powerful words. Rayshard Brooks, right? How does someone who's sleeping in their car in a drive-through, who falls asleep in their car, end up dead mere moments later, right? Elijah McClain, right? Authorities received the call that he looked suspicious. And as it turns out, he, I believe, was anemic and was wearing a face mask and was coming home from a convenience store. I believe he was 21 years old, right? And I think that piece around a face mask, again, becomes really, really interesting because I too have a number of face masks. Many of us have face masks living in this area, particularly if you go skiing, right? But then there's also the piece that is a bit more romanticized when you think about, Black Panther or Spider-Man. These are critical characters that I grew up with and inspired me, right, to play dress up and to wear masks to this very day as very much a grown-up. And so when I think about Elijah McClain, I just think again about the tragic nature of he wasn't even showing up thinking about a romanticized character. He was wearing a face mask to take care of himself, right? Atiana Jefferson, this is a person that whose name we may hear, we may not hear enough, but on an evening where she was playing games with her video games with her nephew, she left her front door open, the screen door was not ajar, it was attached, and a neighbor called for a wellness check because her door was open, and it results in her death, right? And so very similar to Daniel Prude, right? When we're thinking about a wellness check, how does a wellness check result in the death, right, of one of our fellow human beings, right? And so it's critical that we speak their names and that we hold this space around equity and racial equity and justice because, but for right? George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many of our fellow Black siblings, right? Would we be in this space of taking another huge step forward for justice? Okay. And so it's critical that we continue to honor that journey and to organize and to act along that journey that they've created for us, and that we also continue to show up for them and demand justice for their lives. Not sure if you're familiar with the theoretical framework around equity-mindedness. Estela Mata Ben-Simone out of USC, the Center for Urban Education, does some really great work in this space, and I'm a student of Ben-Simone's. And so this is really the foundation of our conversation for today, right? Thinking about the ways in which, if we're equity-minded, how are we showing up with a race consciousness, right? A willingness to talk about race in meaningful and authentic ways and challenging and critical ways, right? How are we being systemically aware? The notion of systemic racism, okay, it's not new. In fact, it's age old, right? And I think in one of the pieces, if you read the Tatum piece that I sent to you, she alludes to this notion of the systemic and anti-racism, and we'll get to that shortly. You know, thinking about the ways in which our institutions, including WSU Vancouver, including all of our campuses across the WSU system, are institutionally focused, right? How are we showing up to dismantle, right, the varying systems of oppression that we uphold, right? What are we doing to be evidence-based, right? To be equity-informed in our inquiry? And finally, as I mentioned from the outset, how are we advancing equity, both as individuals, right? And also agents within these spaces of privilege, such as universities, including WSU. All right, so when we're thinking about equity-mindedness, right, we're really looking at the process of racial equity, first of all, right? And when we're thinking about racial equity as a process, we're looking at the ways in which it illuminates, right, individuals and groups as being disadvantaged, okay, and privileged within a system of institutional and structural oppression. And it's really important that we name the rootedness in white supremacy, right? The rootedness in whiteness that we see, you know, across the structures, right? From leadership, right down through to policies, processes, practices, and pedagogies, okay? And so when we're thinking about the result or the outcome of racial equity, we're really looking at how do we dismantle oppression, right? How do we dismantle systemic oppression within our structures, our institutions, our universities, right? That leads to a rebalancing of power, right? That shift in social power and opportunity and outcomes that center Black people, brown people, Indigenous people, Native and Asian people, people of color, and historically underrepresented people, right? When we're doing the work around equity-mindedness and disruption of the status quo, we're also doing the work to formalize anti-racism across policies, processes, and practices. And there's also one step further here when we're thinking about equity-mindedness, and that is as a practice, right? How are we showing up to then do this work on a daily basis, the practice of racial equity, right? Utilizing our racial equity lens, right? To formalize anti-racist policies, processes, and practices. okay? And so when we think about how do you show up in this work, right? I want to ask this question, and you can type your answers in the chat box, right? But one of the questions that I think is critical is, first of all, do you have a racial identity, right? Do you see yourself as having a racial identity? You don't have to say what your racial identity is, but do you have a racial identity? And do you have a culture, right? And many times when I pose this question, I find that folks are clear on the first part of it, right? Yes, I do have a racial identity, or my racial identity is, right, me personally, my racial identity, I identify as Black, Black American, African American, of African heritage, right? And I use those interchangeably. Do you have a culture? Many times I find that, particularly for white colleagues, right, this question of culture becomes one that that can present a bit more of a pause, that, okay, well, do I have a culture? I'm not sure what my culture is, right? And so the thing about this is that everyone has a racial identity and everyone has a culture. And what's critical in understanding culture is, one, how you show up in defining that. I'm not defining culture in this space today, but I do think it's important to recognize differences as it relates to culture, right? As opposed to sameness or the non-existence of culture, right? And there's a piece of that again, if you go a little bit deeper with culture and thinking about, well, do I have one, or the mere question of do I have one, to question that, are you coming from a privileged perspective in questioning if you have culture, right? Or not recognizing the culture of other communities and groups, right? And so the differences is a key piece when we're thinking about culture. We all have experiences with race, right? These experiences can be covert, overt, implicit, explicit, right? And again, one may not recognize ever having had such experiences with race, right? And again, speaking to this notion of privilege, to not recognize that, okay, am I participating in something that could demean or demoralize a person or a group? And I may not even recognize that I do it, or that I'm doing it, right? People may be targeted because of their racial identity. We may witness the targeting of others and or experience opportunities and privileges based on our racial identity, right? And so again, how fine-tuned is your racial equity lens? How fine-tuned is your lens to be critical, right, of what we see happening in our communities, what we see happening to our fellow human beings, and what we see being reproduced in our policies and our processes and practices. And so I want you to do some reflection, right? And this is one thing that I'd like for you to take away from today. And that is, what is your earliest experience dealing with racism, right? Even if the experience was well-meaning, what is your earliest experience dealing with racism? What was your response? And what was the response of others around you? What impact did this have on you? What did you learn from the experience, right? What are you still learning from the experience? You know, I think about trauma and re-trauma, particularly in this space that we're in now, of seeing so many Black men and women, you know, lose their lives, and also thinking about our transgender siblings, right, who are also disproportionately targeted, particularly Black trans women who are disproportionately targeted by violence, right? And the re-trauma, the constant trauma that causes, and the heaviness that it weighs on individuals in general, and especially Black and brown people, right? And so thinking about that impact, did the encounter change you in some way? If so, how? You know, thinking about while this incident was happening, how did you feel, right? Did you feel a sense of helplessness? Did you feel a sense of, hey, I can do something about this? You know, and did you tell or report the experience to someone else, right? And so those are some critical questions as you're thinking about your showing up, right? And your own lived experience as it relates to race and racism, okay? What occurred? What is your earliest remembrance? Right, so I want you to do some reflection on that piece. So we get this, this piece around racism. What is racism? So I want to open this up to you all here, and please offer your responses in the chat. What is racism? Racism is, so judging someone based on looks, thank you. Treating people differently based on their race. Thank you for that. Yes. Racism is knowingly or unknowingly treating others differently. Yes. Based on skin color, perceived race, a system based on, did I see privilege there? Yeah, giving privilege to someone, not others based on race. Treating people worse because of their race. Oh, that's good, okay. Actions, yes, based on prejudices. Making assumptions of someone based on their skin color. Actions based on fear, good. A social construct, yes. Right, that's right. When we're thinking about our social identities, we do have to recognize and remember that they are socially constructed. However, when we think about the history of enslavement, right, that isn't how race was viewed. And, you know, Black people in particular weren't even viewed as people. Oppressive systems, comments, actions, or laws, good, against people of a certain race. Any idea, behavior, policy, good. So I'm seeing these pieces around policy come into play. Racial identity, thank you for including that piece around racial identity and culture. Appreciate that. Okay, using privilege and position of power, so good. I'm seeing a lot of you talk about, you know, differences and power, which I think is so critical to the discussion, and privilege, right? Social privilege, social power, prejudice, right? The ways in which our own mindsets show up, seeing one race as superior to another. So I'm gonna want those to continue to come in. And one of the things that I think is important to do when we're looking at isms, right, is to really think about, well, what is the suffix, right? What is ism? And it pretty much tells us, at least, that we're dealing with a system of some sort here, right? A practice or a philosophy, right? And so a system of advantage based on race is one of the definitions that Daniel Tatum uses, right? And that was from the piece that I have sent you all ahead of our time today, right? And so thinking about racism through this lens of a system of advantage, right, based on race. And as some of you alluded to, it could be that system of disadvantage, right? based on race. It's not only this personal ideology of racial prejudice, but the system involving messages, right? These sort of cultural messages and institutional policies and practices, right? Beliefs and actions of individuals. And this becomes really critical because now there's this piece of not only the ways in which we show up, but the ways in which we're showing up and enacting, right, these very official rules that may have an impact on communities at large, and then specifically communities of a particular group or race in this case, right? Another definition that my students, like I have taught a course in education around cultural responsiveness, right, for educators. And that, again, is around racial prejudice plus social power, right, reproduces or perpetuates racism or oppression, right? And so accessing social, cultural, economic resources, decision-making, right? And these all lead to systemically and institutionally racist policies and practices, right? So again, that racial prejudice plus social power. And the thing about leading with the ism is that you can also assign this definition to other isms, right? And so if we're thinking about classism, right, a system of advantage based on class, or ageism, a system of advantage based on age, right? And so when we're thinking about racism, it is absolutely critical to be thinking about the systemic nature, right? And as many of you mentioned, social power, privilege, and again, the systemic piece rooted in policies and practices. What about systemic racism, right? So we talked about systems here, talked about social power, privilege, hearing you all mention policies, practices. Systemic racism seems like the phrase of the moment, but again, it is not a new framework or foundation. It's really the foundation that our country is founded on, systemic racism. And so based on what you know about systemic racism, maybe some of you have been involving yourselves in the work of Kendi. How would we define it? And you can use the chat box for this. So allows people to dehumanize a group, individuals based on race, skin color, thank you. Systemic racism. The history of one race having political and social power over others. Yeah, enacting laws that are generational, thank you for that, made to oppress a group. And preserve their own power. That's a critical stake, yeah, critical piece there. Policies that are put in place to prevent others from advancing, but disguised as beneficial for all. Oh, that's really good. Yeah, that really speaks to the insidious nature, right? Or the hegemonic nature of systemic oppression, right? That it's so ingrained that how dare one question it? Underlying policies and structures that give power to one group over another, long-standing, right, oppression. This is good. When my high school students point out that our textbook calls people African-American, Native American, but whites are just Americans. Oh, that's important. Yep, that's important. Yeah, and that is another piece too. I do call myself American, right? And you know, that's a piece about identity, is that how does one see themselves versus how the society at large sees you. So sort of this dual consciousness. Am I not American? Right? And so thank you for that. Yeah. societal construct, intended or unintended disadvantaging based on race. Good, so keep those coming in, please. And I want to offer a few more that echo what you all have already named here. And right, and so I like this by Derek Johnson of NAACP, you know, these systems and structures that have procedures or processes that disadvantage African Americans, right? You know, Glenn Harris for Race Forward talks about the complex interaction of culture, policy, and institutions that holds in place the outcomes we see in our lives. Systemic racism is naming the process of white supremacy, right? And so naming that process. And we talked about that a little bit earlier when we're looking at racial equity as a process, right? That process of illuminating advantages and disadvantages, illuminating, in this case, the haves, right? White supremacy, where do we see that existing across power structures, and how do policies, processes, and practices, right, maintain that power? And then, of course, Kendi, right? Calling systemic racism a collection of racist policies that leads to racial inequities that are substantiated by racist ideas, right? And so in all of these, we have to be thinking again about the ways in which we're showing up, because we know that these policies are created, right, by folks in power in certain spaces and in an institution or structure, right? And what sort of ideas are they showing up with? And so when we're talking about the expansion of one's critical lens or one's racial equity lens, right, this is a lifetime commitment, right, to have that shift in my ideas so that I can at least notice how this particular policy or practice may impact, right, or adversely impact communities of color, right? How this may adversely impact Black and Brown people, Indigenous people, right, Native people, Asian people, right? And having and feeling empowered enough to name that, particularly around the boardroom table, as it were, right? And even stretching beyond the boardroom table to recognize the need to create additional tables and seats. You know, the proverbial, you know, having a seat at the table. And I hear that and receive that. And we also need to be working to create new tables and new seats, right, that are imbued with anti-racism and equity that we're also showing up to realize this work. Okay, and so again, that notion of the racist ideas, right, substantiating racial inequities, reproducing racial inequities. It's critical that we name the forms of racism. I call them the eyes of racism. And so one that I name here is ideological. I'm in the chat box. Would any of you want to name some of the other eyes that you're aware of? The eye of racism. So the ideological, again, when we think about Kendi, our racist ideas, how we're showing up to a space, right, with notions, racist notions that go unchecked, right, that go unchecked. And so I'm seeing institutional, yes, thank you. Implicit, idiotic, oh, that's a good eye. Yes, idiotic is a very good eye. It is not one that is on this list, but I am going to add it. Thank you for that. Yes, absolutely. Idiotic superiority nonsense. Good. Right? And so let me see if there are others that show up here. Okay. And so individual, interpersonal, right? And so again, where we see the idiotic superiority, that's exactly what we're talking about here. This idea of superiority and control, right, becomes permitted, reinforced thinking about these dominant groups or dominants, personally mistreating individuals from targeted groups, implicitly, as somebody mentioned, and explicitly. So we may see this in the form of microaggressions, right? Racist interactions, stereotype threat, where I'm showing up to a space and I am doing my best as the only Black person in that space to not confirm what I think this predominantly white group thinks of me, the stereotypes that they already hold, right? And then the moment that I do something that may confirm that group may say, see, I told you, all Black people are like this, right? And that transferred oppression onto individuals, which can become internalized, right? And that internalized oppression is so deeply entrenched in each of us, right? In the education system, there's the Clark doll test, right? African-American psychologists who did this work around perceptions of skin tone, and tell me which doll is the good doll, tell me which doll is the bad doll, right? And across racial groups, white, Black, brown, alike, children chose the white doll as being, quote unquote, the good doll, and the doll with the most melanin, right, in their complexion, as being the bad doll, right? And so these messages that are internalized from a very early age, and these are messages that can be negative, right, toward one group, and can also be really positive about another group. And as someone mentioned earlier, is that it's so deeply entrenched that you don't even have to question it, right? And you can rely on the targeted group to continue to reproduce the message about superiority, right? And so again, the insidious nature of racism has to be named, which is another I. And then finally, institutional, right? And when we're thinking about institutional, we're looking at structural, we're looking at the systemic, how institutions and systems reinforce and manifest these ideologies, right? And it's embedded, again, throughout our structures. And I don't know if any of you had the chance to do the homework that I assigned, but looking at just a few of our structures: education, housing, employment, law enforcement, criminal justice, wealth attainment, right? Seeing the ways in which policies and practices and processes, right, reproduce systems of advantage and disadvantage. And we find that through any of those structures that I named, not to mention media, right, transportation, so many others. And so racism, again, all of these forms that we see here, maintained by social power, policy, prejudice, right? And they each support one another. These are all interconnections, or another framework that we call this would be intersectionality, right? The interlocking systems of oppression, right? The systems themselves, and the ways in which one with multiple identities, right, interact within these systems and experience oppression within each of these systems, right? And so the focus on Blackness per se, it's not at the exclusion of the experiences of brown people, indigenous people, Native American people, Asian people, right? There's also a piece of this that when we look at those who experience disproportionality, right, at some of the greatest lengths and extents, right, we see that occurring within Black spaces within Black communities. And so it's important that when we're thinking about Black Lives Matter, right? And some of you may have heard the refrain, when Black lives matter, then all lives will matter, right? That really is talking about when we control for individuals who experience the greatest levels of inequities and disparities, right? And create anti-racist and equitable policies, processes, practices. Everyone benefits from that, right? Everyone benefits from anti-racist policies. And so it's critical that we name, right, our fellow human beings who are experiencing those critical and disproportionate, disparate inequities as compared to their counterparts. Even with the recent study that came out of Pullman around policing, right? And it showed that Black people make up 2.7% of the Pullman population, but account for more than 10% of arrests, right? And Black people are being, they're encountering police more than 4 times their white, Asian, Indigenous, Native American, and Latinx counterparts, right? And so again, we have to be willing to name the disproportionate levels of communities at large, and especially of Black people across structures, okay? And so I do want to be mindful of our time, but I do hope that you had some time to engage with the homework. I have it up here, and you'll be able to access it still by way of this recording, right? But as you have a moment, take a look at these particular structures, these systems: education, healthcare, housing, law enforcement, criminal justice, employment, and wealth attainment. And I think it'd be interesting for you to browse the results and to jot down things that strike you and record them, and continue to engage in the work. It's so important that we spoke names at the outset of our time together. And I also think it's critical that we recognize that nearly 190,000 of our fellow human beings have succumbed to COVID-19, right? And again, the disproportionate numbers of those deaths have been of Black people, especially, and brown people, Indigenous people, and Native American people. And it's a tragedy all around as it relates to all of our fellow human beings who suffer and who have passed. And then when we name those critical pieces around the disproportionality, right, that also speaks to the nature of healthcare, right, and disparities that we see within that structure. Okay, and so I want to move ahead just a hair here and get us to some actions that you could begin looking at taking. And so one of the pieces that I want for you to take away of many that I've named today is that of being systemically aware, right? And I love what you all have named in the chat thus far, right? And when we're thinking about how are we being systemically aware, we're acknowledging that these inequities did not just happen, right? That they were created over time through policy and entrenched in maintaining the status quo, right? We have to recognize the ways in which our country, right, the United States, was built by enslaved people, right? People who were not even considered people, 3/5 of a person, right? From the Capitol to the White House, right? With the ending of enslavement, 1865 or 1867, if we look at Juneteenth, right? The control of Black lives didn't end there. You have Jim Crow, right? The New Deal, right? Which also disproportionately impacted Black people, particularly in the South. These are some of the biggest contributors to inequity. in the US. We also have to be looking at, of course, there's housing, redlining, right, that occurs, a policy that denied home ownership to Black Americans. And when we look at wealth attainment, right, home ownership is critical, right? And just thinking about wealth and attainment of wealth and maintaining wealth through generations, right? Black people by law have been deliberately and systematically shut out. The criminal justice system, 13% of our overall US population is that of Americans who are Black, right? Yet Americans who are Black make up 40% of our US prison population, right? And so we also can't ignore Black codes in the Pacific Northwest, right? The Oregon Territory has its roots in a constitutional ban, okay? Black exclusion laws from June 26, 1844, which the 26 happens to be my birthday. And so it's interesting to share this stat in that regard. And, you know, Black exclusion laws in this region, right? I mean, they have really reproduced what we know now in terms of Portland being the whitest big city in the US, right? Oregon's population was nearly 87% white as of 2019. The Black population was just over 2%. And so we can't ignore the vestiges, right, of Black exclusion, right? These laws were repealed almost a century ago, right? But the racist language in the Constitution wasn't repealed until 2002. And even then, 30% of voters elected to keep the racist language, right, within that Constitution. So let that sink in, right? It wasn't that long ago, 18 years ago, 30% elected to keep. Even in the state of Washington, there's research out there that talks about we've had up to 100 African people who were enslaved in the state of Washington. You know, I grapple with living in a state named after George Washington, and you know, his silhouette is on all the signs, and he enslaved over 300 people, right? King County, up until 1986, right? When our regent, Sims, right, really led the charge to have King County named after Martin Luther King Jr. Up until that point, it was named after William R. King, right? The third US VP who was a proponent of the enslavement of African peoples. So again, the vestiges of these policies, the vestiges of these practices serve to reproduce what we feel today across systems, structures, institutions, right? The policing of Black people in particular, policing was founded out of the enslavement of Africans, right? There were slave catchers who were tasked with bringing Black people to justice, and that justice often resulted in their deaths, right? Their lynchings, their killings, okay? And so I'm going to skip ahead just to get to some of the solutions here. And as I do that, I do want to open up the box here for any thoughts or comments that you may have. I love that piece here. I'm seeing someone said infectious when thinking about racism, and that's really good. Yeah. Okay. And so, so there's a piece that we need to think about when we're looking at disruption. And if you have the chance, take a look at this link, The Faces of American Power, Nearly as White as the Oscar Nominees. And it breaks down, right, the boardrooms, as it were, right, and those individuals who hold that top 1% of power in the United States, right? And these are folks who are making critical decisions across our structures and those systems that we name. Even if we look at, I've been doing some work with our Vancouver City Council, and 99.9% of our city council is white. And that's over a 163-year period. They have never had a person of color on the city council, right? 83% of university presidents, tenured professors, House of Representatives and Senate, CEO level positions, Forbes 400, public school superintendents, athletic team owners, US presidents, right? Starkly white. And when we account for which the 83% and below is counting for white men, right? And when we account for white people in general, these numbers increase, with the exception of the US presidency, of course, right? And so there are some critical pieces here that we have to be willing to lean into. Yeah, and thank you for that comment, Jenny, right? And so when we're looking at our boards, right, these decision-making bodies, these powerful individuals, right, how are we creating space that is truly, right, a diversity and a diverse representation across experiences and also identities, including racial identities, right? And so I want us to get to these strategies, and I just have just a couple more slides here around strategies to realize racial equity, anti-racism, and justice. And first, we need to acknowledge our past history, right, as it relates to anti-Blackness. And we also have to recognize the work that we're doing and have been doing as it relates to anti-racism, right? And so there's a piece of that where absolutely, let's name, right, our spaces for growth, right, and begin to reconcile with a history of anti-Blackness, but also has there been any work that we've done intentionally to become an anti-racist organization, right? I think about 1920, right, WSU, we had a first with Winfred Jordan, right? The first African-American student, was a graduate student, but that was 1920. That was years before the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, right? And so there are some critical firsts that we've had at WSU, and we also have to think about our racist past. How do we show up in terms of anti-Blackness, right? And so some things to think about: interviewing former leaders, educators, consulting our local historical societies. What about our yearbooks and journals? There was a time there that we kept seeing this, onslaught of images of people wearing black and brown face, white people wearing black and brown face in yearbooks, right? We need to explore our own history in this regard and be willing to name that and to share that. Thinking about our campus rituals, symbols, artifacts, right? One of the ways in which inequities continue to pervade and reproduce is by way of donorship, right? The ways in which we name our buildings, our scholarships, our traditions, right? Those are upheld by the economic pieces, the financial support. And who are those supporters? Who are those donors? How are we connecting with our Black and Brown and Indigenous and Native and Asian donors, right? And what are we doing to create buildings that are named after them, right? We've done some good work as it relates to Elson Floyd, particularly within the medical school and the cultural center. And I would love to see Elson Floyd's name represented on our other campuses, right? I would love to see more dedication to our Native American siblings and the lands on which we sit, right? And so identifying tangible and concrete ways to account for our history, right? And really be thinking about ways in which we're showing up to create endowed professorships, endowed scholarships, tuition, named programs, and such. Amplify and affirm voices of Black people, right? Be culturally responsive to students and colleagues, right? What is it like to live in this region? Not only do we have to show up in predominantly white spaces on many of our campuses, but we also have to live in this region. There was some research by Partners in Diversity that talked about 74% of people of color who work in the Southwest Washington and Portland region, right, experience racism within the workplace or discrimination. And 97% experience those levels of discrimination within the communities at large, right? And so there's a piece of this that I'm showing up to my workplace, having experienced racism already, and now I'm coming into the workplace and experiencing it again. And what is going to be that one strike, that last straw before I say, this is it, I don't want to be here anymore, it's no longer safe for me, right? And so we have to be thinking about that again, the intersections that I mentioned earlier, right, across Black, same gender loving, bisexual, trans, plus communities, students, caregivers, learners, people with disabilities, folks who are justice impacted, veterans, foster youth, so on and so forth. Listen to our people of color communities, including Black people. Believe Black people when you're told of one's lived experience with oppression or one's lived experience with targeting. We've done some of that work on our campus. We've had some listening sessions over the past couple of years and have been able to engage and connect with our communities. How are we addressing anti-Blackness in the context of the classroom, right? What are we doing to decolonize our classroom spaces? Thinking about your curriculum, your syllabi, the invisibility and hypersurveillance that can occur, particularly for students who are the only person of color in the class, right? How are we creating space that we're not targeting them, even if it's unintentional, right? So what are some culturally responsive strategies that we can engage so that we're not constantly committing racial microaggressions, right? Ascribing a level of intelligence to one group versus the other, assuming criminality of Black and brown bodies. Student services, right? Thinking about how do we reframe that one additional question that we ask? Well, there's nothing more I can do for you, right? That reproduces a system of underserved students, right? Or that's a very rigorous major. I'm not sure it's best for you, right? And so you're under-challenging students. Or why are you here, right? Is WSU really the campus that you should be at, right? Is there another place that may be more of a better fit for you, right? So again, that feeling of unwelcome, a sense of I don't belong here. And then of course, outreach, recruitment, matriculation, graduation. We have to continue to do the work around recognizing the opportunity gap and becoming institutionally focused such that we're student ready and not expecting students to adapt to, right, the insidious nature of a systemic racist organization, right? So what are we doing to become focused to meet their needs as opposed to them adapting to a historically white culture, as it were. Outreach, recruitment, hiring, retention, promotion of staff, faculty, and also looking at the C-suite, right? I think it's critical that we look at this across all levels, our notice of vacancies, position descriptions, search committees. How are we infusing equity language in our notices of vacancies, position descriptions, right? What do campus visits look like, right, for these individuals who show up? Addressing employee concerns, hiring, retention, retention, promotion again, the annual review process, right? How again are we creating space that equity and diversity perhaps has its own category? And that's true, I would say, even in the tenure process. What if there was an additional category around equity, diversity, and inclusion contributions, right? For many faculty, particularly faculty of color, whose research may also be within this space of racial equity and such, right? They're often not deemed as competitive, right? Or not deemed as rigorous, right? And so how do we, again, create these spaces to reframe that? School discipline, right? And so again, thinking about the ways in which students of color are overrepresented, right? Within discipline measures. Conduct, are we seeing more students of color, including Black students, overrepresented in conduct referrals? Policing, this has been so critical, and we're doing some work on our campuses, including WSU Vancouver, right? Where we're looking at, okay, how do we create space that is culturally responsive, right? What could we be doing? Intrusive and ongoing professional development, for one, that focuses on anti-Blackness, anti-racism. I think Pullman has an advisory board, right? Perhaps that's something that other communities could be looking at, right? What are opportunities that we have for building community and humanizing, right, our police, right? What are some open house opportunities that we could be doing? What are some, you know, the ways in which our police show up to meetings and such, right? Uniforms or no uniforms at certain events and meetings. From this piece, I would mention that about statements. We've seen so many statements around solidarity, right? But if your statement does not include action steps, then it's merely performative, right? It's merely performative. And I often say a good campus statement, right? It's important to release, and it must also have accompanying actions, concrete actions. What is it that the university is doing, but what is it that you can do in this time, right? And that is a difference maker. On our campus, some of the statements that we've released, I often receive feedback from the community to say, and thank you for offering things that I can do to help move us forward or to help move myself forward, right? We have to continue to engage in that. Develop clear policies on hate crimes, hate speech, but also examining the nature of protected speech, right? There's that fine line that people can go up to and microaggress, macroaggress to the point that, again, is this the last straw for a Black or brown person before they decide to leave this university as well as this region, right? And because the numbers are relatively small across people of color communities, right? They may show up as statistically insignificant, but for those who are members of these communities, it is absolutely and wholly significant. And it's significant to the university as well, right? We should be working to maintain and to invite, right, individuals from a plethora of communities, including people of color communities. Black resource centers, many folks often think that we have to do this work within the space of student affairs. I challenge you to think about what is it that I can be doing within my unit, right, that fosters a sense of celebration and preserving of Black communities, brown communities, indigenous communities, so on and so forth, and really looking at the ways in which these centers can be created. I think our student affairs units, equity and diversity and inclusion offices, you know, on our varying campuses, mine, Pullman, Vancouver, Pullman, and the medical school, right, are doing some really good work in this space in Spokane, Tri-Cities, Everett. We're all doing work in this space. What more can we be doing? Okay, what more can we do? And there's always more. Disaggregate student success data, right? And I've been naming Black, Brown, Indigenous, Native, Asian communities. And it's so critical to disaggregate the data because oftentimes Asian communities are pinned as a group that does not experience disproportionality or disparities, right? And when we begin to disaggregate that data, we do begin to see disparities within particular groups. So it's critical that we're looking at disaggregating data across access, campus efforts, retention, and challenging notions of excellence, right? And that's the piece that as we're considering equity work and racial equity, we should be looking at equity as imbued in excellence, just as we do with academics, right? These should all be intertwined, the academics, excellence, equity, right? They're not mutually exclusive as relates to equity. And so excellence, considering the ways in which these particular objectives show up, right? And I think that first point is really important, proportion of Black students who graduate with honors, right? Or the proportion of students of color who graduate with honors. And you know, I've seen some disparities there just with an initial look at that. Intrusive outreach for students, staff, and faculty of color, right? When racist incidents occur on our campuses, what is our system? What is our form of mobilizing to check in and offer support, right? Offering that genuine concern, the well-being, but also naming concrete actions that are being taken. Generally, again, universities may offer a statement of some sort. It's critical that you're naming what your actions are. And I think we've all had some experiences with this. We've had a number of extremist groups on our campuses, right? And those have required that we show up and that we mobilize our campus response teams, campus bias response teams, and keep our community informed of what we're doing to maintain a safe, welcoming, and a space where folks feel, again, that sense of belonging, right? That I show up for you because I care about you, because I love you and you're important to me. And then finally, building a community of equity, anti-racism, and belonging, right? What are we doing to formally adopt a racial equity lens? There's a webpage on my unit's website for Office of Equity and Diversity. And we have a series of resources, this Equity and Justice Resources webpage, which includes some models for adopting a racial equity lens, right? And so please visit our site and check out the resources there. We also have a series of book lists that are available to you. Pursue ongoing professional learning, opportunities, anti-racism. On our campus, we do have the BASE program, Building a Community of Equity, as well as the Intercultural Development Inventory. But whether or not you're using the IDI, there are other tools to measure one's cultural responsiveness and one's ability or capability to shift in their cultural perspective. The Harvard Implicit Association Test, the IAT, that's free. Engaging in reflection and journaling, which I've invited you to do today. And having some intergroup dialogue, as we've been able to do with our chat. That is so important. Employee resource groups. What are we doing on our campuses to really build that affinity for Blackness and brownness and Indigenous experience and Asian experience, right? And I know that on our respective campuses, we do have some groups. On our campus, we do have the Support and Empowerment for Employees of Color Association. And we're actually coming up this week on our third annual Welcome Back Mixer for faculty, staff, and students of color. Especially in this time of COVID, and we're trying to build connection in these little boxes, right? We have to be creative, unconventional, and again, showing up in a space of love to create that touch. with the passing of Chadwick Boseman, what I noticed in some of the clips that they showed was sort of this laying of the hands, right? As he would tell his stories, and you would see his castmates laying their hands on him. That's what so many of us are craving at this moment, and us in general. And then I think communities of color, especially in the wake of so many untimely passings and killings. How can we create that virtual laying of the hands through resource groups and affinity, building affinity? Intentionally showing up to impact change across policies, practices, and processes. And this is what I'll leave you with today, with that in mind. And before I say that, also visit our virtual gallery of affirmations. That is one of the spaces where we try to create that virtual laying of the hands, and that's available from the front page of our, the landing page of WSU Vancouver. But I want to leave you with this, and I recognize that we're just a hair over time, but commit to change agency, right? Take a step beyond allyship. Right? Allyship is great, but it's also somewhat passive, right? We are at a point that, and I want for you to reach a place where you stretch your allyship to change agency, to advocacy, to accompliceship, right? So from today, what is at least one thing you will do to realize equity and justice from wherever you sit within the university, whatever your position, whatever your unit? What is at least one thing you will commit to today, right, to realize equity and justice across policies, practices, and processes? Okay, and with that, if you want to offer any additional thoughts or comments in the chat, open to that. But again, want to be mindful of time. Let's connect on social channels, Twitter, Facebook. You can also email me. And again, I'm grateful to hold this space with you all today, and just continue to keep this work moving forward. Racial equity and justice, it has to be at the root of everything that we do throughout the WSU system. So thank you so much.